Hey, welcome back to the Mining Pod. On today's show, we're talking Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining news, as always, after a quick word from our sponsors. Are you a retail or institutional investor interested in Bitcoin mining companies? The Miner Mag brings you free data and analysis from all major NASDAQ-listed Bitcoin mining operations to know who stands out. Check out visualized metrics and data-dependent stories at theminermag.com. Thanks for listening to the Mining Pod. Want more? Subscribe to our main feed on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts for another weekly show on Bitcoin stocks. And check out our newsletter at miningpod.blockspace.media today. Okay, another week and more Bitcoin news to go forward with. We got Colin, Matt. Welcome to the show. And we're going to have Corinne from Compass come on in a little bit, discuss the hosting market, which is always nice to get a little insights into that world. We're going to start, as always, Matt, little difficulty update, if you will.
Yeah, we just recently had a difficulty increase.
How recently, Matt?
Recently,
What was the dramatic pause there for?
as recently as about 300 blocks ago. Pretty significant, 3.9%. But I mean, if we check out hash price, right, which is really what everyone cares about in the mining space. We've basically, like, I don't know if you could pull it up here on the screen for those watching on YouTube, but outside of a couple days, we've basically been range bound since the halving between like 45 and 55 dollars per petahash per second per day. And so we're at the kind of lower bound of that range now after this increase. It makes sense, right, that we would have difficulty increase after all the price action lately. A lot of miners are kind of tight on the margins. And so when we get a decent amount of price action, that tends to show up in hash rate.
Fees are pretty flat. And to your point, Matt, we've kind of been in a crab market for hash price, barring a few episodes with things like inscriptions and ordinals having a resurgence, just having these kind of brief blips of action with the transaction fees, which have sent hash price higher. Above that kind of mean for the last few months. But I think going back to just the most recent difficulty adjustment, I mean, hash rate recently hit an all-time high of 734 exahashes a second on the 7-day average in a like meteoric rise, over the last week. It just took off from like 668 to 734. I think what we're seeing is just all of these next generation miners like the M60 series and S21 series finally getting deployed. Someone's definitely, putting up some serious hash rate somewhere. I mean, this is a huge jump from what we have been seeing. But if you look at the 3-month too, we've really been seesawing over the last 3 months. Some of that is because of summer curtailment, other things like that. But it's been all over the place. So we're clearly setting a new, I think, floor over the last month or so with some of these new machines coming online. So just my 2 cents with that.
There's been some increase in transaction fees. I'd say it's like almost like a 5x. So right now we're at 47 sats per VByte, whereas the last few weeks we've been looking at this, it's been in that like between 2 to 10 sats per VByte. So there's a nice increase there, but it's not enough to really, build a mining farm on. And then, of course, the price change has been nice. There have been a few spikes in fees lately with runes mints, which you can check out on Bitcoin Season 2, where we talk about that stuff more. But yeah, for the most part, it's been pretty boring, which means we can probably jettison this part of the conversation and move over to Russia with Colin.
It's election season, so obviously we have to have news of Russia. So... but this time coming from the Bitcoin mining side, this is from Matthew Sigel. I'm sorry, man, I'm butchering your name. Head of digital assets at VanEck. And this was from a Bloomberg terminal that basically says at the BRICS summit, which is kicked off in Kazan, Russia, just terrible pronunciation today. I apologize to our listeners. Basically saying that crypto is on the table at the discussion tables at this summit. And this Bloomberg terminal says top lawmakers are pushing the idea that Russian miners could sell their Bitcoin to international buyers. These buyers could then use Bitcoin and other crypto to pay for imports, effectively bypassing Western sanctions. for those who don't know what BRICS is, it's a pretty big coalition that has expanded much beyond its original scope. I believe the B, it stands for, the whole thing acronym is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, I believe. I might be wrong about the S there. But it's essentially this coalition of countries that typically fall out of the geopolitical international power dynamic that we usually see with, G7 countries, like the United States, Japan, Great Britain, France, Germany, etc. And what this story is basically nodding to is something that people have been speculating for a long time, that Russia could use Bitcoin as a means to circumvent international sanctions. Russia has a lot of hash rate within its borders. It's obviously a gas-rich nation, so a lot of off-grid and flared gas mining opportunities, along with just, massive power generation from coal plants and other gas plants. So this seems like a natural fit for Russian businesses, the Russian economy. That being said, I think like a lot of caveats here to be made. And one more point to add before I mention those caveats is that there's this crypto news article that Matthew cites under it. It says Russia's BitRiver, Bitcoin mining company, and RDIF, partner for BRICS-wide mining initiative. Basically, this idea that they're going to try to expand mining outside of the West, focusing specifically on these BRICS countries and countries in the East. So a few caveats that I have for this before we, hop into our next story is that, number one, this is not happening yet. This is just something that they've proposed. I think that's important because people see these headlines and they think this is happening. Maybe it is behind the scenes. I don't know, but it seems like it's just being discussed right now. Number two, I don't know how this would work in terms of the companies selling Bitcoin to Western nations that have sanctioned Russia, because they're still sanctioned financially. So there's not really a clear on or off ramp. Now, Matthew goes on to point out that European countries are still buying a lot of Russian gas, right? And it's a sanctioned country right now because of the war going on in Ukraine. So there are obviously workarounds and loopholes that they can maybe exploit for this. But it's unclear to me how exactly this would function on paper. It's like you're selling the Bitcoin to other nations and then they're using the Bitcoin to buy Russian imports. It sounds kind of convoluted to me. And it's going to need some ironing out, I think, before it makes any sense. But curious what y'all think.
One thing that came to mind immediately is seeing BitRiver there. A lot of people use BitRiver in 2020, 2021 for hosting in Russia. And then there's some other stories around like these Russian mining companies are formerly Kazakh miners, and they moved out of Kazakhstan and into Russia. We've covered that on the mining pod quite a few times, mostly because Kazakhstan has just had such a change in its energy policies over the years, and miners could just move up north a little bit, take some of the infrastructure with them, and continue operating. I think for the biggest thing here is that undercurrent within the media of Bitcoin as a option to destabilize the dollar. And when you see BRICS talking about Bitcoin or even forming their own other currency, that's always a shot at the dollar hegemony the United States has, and the fact that a lot of global trade is settled in the dollar. And if the US loses that, then there's going to be a lot of large repercussions for how we can do sanctions, how we do global trade, how we even export our debt. And so that's why people care about these stories. And the BRICS, of course, have a lot of population there. China and India, obviously, both on the billion-dollar scale. And then there's just so much up and coming here, especially with the Brazilian and South African markets. So not something to be ignored. That being said, we do see this headline come around every 6 months and nothing much changes. These Bitcoin miners aren't large enough to be able to really tip the scale. Russia has around 10% of the global network hash rate, and these are just like estimates, kind of backing things out. There's probably more hash rate in Texas than there is in Russia overall. And so it's kind of hard to say like this is actually going to matter. You can only make so many Bitcoin today. If Bitcoin does go to $1 million a coin, maybe that's when it starts mattering. But right now, I just think like this is more of a sensationalist headline than anything. Matt,
I'll play the devil's advocate view. To Colin's point, we don't know if they're actually doing anything, right? But we also don't know they aren't doing anything. So it's kind of like we have no clue. All we see is the headlines. But what we do know is that back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they basically got sanctioned. But beyond that, the U.S. froze some of their foreign currency reserves, and no kind of small chunk. This was in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think that could have raised the red flag both internally to them and to some other countries that don't want to, necessarily play by the rules of Uncle Sam. That if they choose not to, they could also have some of their foreign currency reserves frozen, of which the dollar as the world reserve currency is still a large part in today in a lot of different countries. The other thing is there was an embargo placed on a certain amount of Russia's energy resources. So they could be using those resources to potentially mine Bitcoin. And again, just kind of like transact, do some international trade outside of the traditional banking system where there are, potentially other counterparts like the US or kind of other European countries, right? I think when I think of BRICS, and there are people out there that would certainly correct me and like know more about this, but it's kind of like the mirror reflection of NATO to a degree. It's kind of like the opposite side of things. You have Russia, China, India. To Will's point, you also have Brazil. And I think in the BRICS summit, they announced a couple new parties coming in. I think like Algeria and Turkey and
it's pretty big at this point. It's like a lot of countries.
Yeah. And so, and further to Will's point, right? It's population wise, it may be around the same as those not in BRICS, right? Because there's so many people in China and India. They're I think the top two most populous countries on earth. I think Brazil, is fifth or sixth. They have 200 or so million people there as well. And so you basically have as someone that has always grown up in the States, I have like this bias, this background on what happens here, but you don't hear as much what's happening in some of these countries. And as they're, it seems, potentially like building a coalition, and you kind of hear people like Ray Dalio talk about potentially multipolar world coming about, right? Adopting some crypto payment rails, I think would be a really significant thing for these systems. Not advocating for it. I'm just saying I think it would be. It's potentially a really significant story, right? If this stuff takes off.
It is for sure. And one last point I want to make. Sorry, well, we'll move on, but this is significant and does have ramifications if it's happening. One thing I do want to put a pin in is I'm a little leery of anything that evokes the Russian boogeyman in the American sphere of influence or politics or economics. We've seen this since the Cold War, essentially, with the USSR. It's like one of the main antagonists of the US being pointed to and saying, this is why we can't have nice things. And I just hope that this isn't used as some sort of pretext for cracking down on Bitcoin or crypto related financial services or the industry writ large. Because I do think that there is a precedent for, trumpeting these stories and then using them as a reason for curtailing certain freedoms or certain, rights and whatnot. So
just say it. Just say it, Colin. Elizabeth Warren's going to run with this headline. She's going to see the mining pod.
I mean, honestly, I'm surprised she probably has a tweet out already about it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's just the elephant in the room. Russia was used as the pretext for the Steele dossier that they used to go after Trump in his first term that turned out to be completely fabricated. So until I see maybe a transcript or real a real world application of this strategy, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical about whether or not this is actually happening. But I just wanted to get that out there so that we don't seem like we're too scrupulous.
One more thing. One more geopolitical talking point on the Bitcoin podcast.
I was going to say, if they are mounting a attack or using, Bitcoin, crypto, whatever, to mount attack against the dollar, and they are leveraging these systems, it puts competitive pressure on the United States to also consider using these systems, right? Or at least having their own sorts of treasuries, just in case, right? If it's operating outside of their control, they need to have a plan. They
That's why
need
they
to have
love
a why
stablecoins.
not, right? So
Why
I think
not?
very interesting. Very interesting. It's an election topic, which is
It is, yeah.
we started from nothing, and now
We're
Bitcoin is
still
on the global stage.
Okay. I'm ripping us away. We're all too young to have tenured opinions on Russia's trade war value. Okay, let's leave Russia and let's go to northern New York. Just as cold and maybe just as draconian bureaucracy and stupid rules for Bitcoin. And we're going to talk about this plant, Massena Bitcoin mining operation, set to receive significant investment for expansion at former Alcoa East plant. So to the untenured eye, this story might not matter, but it does. This is the Coinmint site in North New York. It's been around for quite a while. They have about 430 megawatts of capacity, and I do not believe that all of it's used. And as the headline shows, it's a former aluminum smelting plant that was used for quite a while, using hydropower from Niagara and maybe some other rivers up there. Coinmint's been looking at selling the site for a while, based on just a lot of BD and brokers I've talked to in the space, but it never happened. And they were pricing this like in the $60 to $70 million range for the site. It looks like they finally got someone to jump in and help them build it out, though, and that's NYDIG. NYDIG is a really well-known broker lender in the space. They did a lot of stuff with Bitcoin ASIC loans back in 2021 with BlockFi, if anyone remembers that company. And they did have some trouble with some of those loans at the time. But now they're back in the market and they put some cash into this. I've been looking around to get more information on like what this deal looked like. And per one source I heard that the total like cash infusion, the valuation of the site based on the cash infusion put it over that $70 million mark I talked about earlier. So a decent amount of cash. Colin, Matt, any thoughts on this site?
Not really. I feel like you kind of covered most of it. I think it's a good reminder that some of the largest operations are not in the public market, though. A lot of focus usually on public equities within Bitcoin mining, right? Because they're front and center. They disclose everything. So they're very easy targets for coverage because you can just analyze everything and then they get all the headlines. But there are a lot of quiet giants lurking in the background in the private markets too. So
in the competitive world of Bitcoin mining, one name stands out: CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner. At CleanSpark, efficiency isn't just a goal, it's our standard. Our sophisticated facilities are built and led by expert teams who care about Bitcoin and the communities we work in. Scale? We've mastered it. Our large-scale operations have set us apart in the industry as examples of community-oriented building. Our track record speaks for itself. We navigate the complexities of the new economy with precision and with skill, continuously achieving operational milestones. Curious about how we do it? We invite you to discover the story behind CleanSpark's success at cleanspark.com.
Okay, let's go over to our next section. We got Karun from Compass joining us. He's going to talk about hosted mining. Welcome, Karun, to the stage. First time on the show.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Okay, so the fun part about this segment is we are going to get some access to the hosted side of the mining market, just like Colin was talking about there with the private side of Bitcoin mining market. It's really hard to know what's actually happening behind the scenes. And with you guys, we get a little look into some data, and then we're also just going to go through some talking points that you have for us about like what's actually happening in Bitcoin mining hosting land, or from a viewpoint of Compass. So I'll give it to you first, do like a little intro spiel on Compass and all that, and then let's get into some of your points. And when you're ready, I can add some of the data to the screen as well.
Yes, sounds good. So Compass Mining is a Bitcoin mining service company. Our core business is providing hosting and hardware solutions for both retail and institutional clients. But that being said, we have a full suite of additional services that we provide to anyone kind of going through their mining journey. So these things like include repairs, logistics, insurance, site procurement, even advisory services for parties that are interested in building out like their own hosting site. Me personally, I've been at Compass for over 3 years now and now lead the hosting business for the team.
Okay. we got a few things on the docket for you: demand, supply, hosting costs, some opportunities and trends. I'll just let you have at it. And I think we're going to pick some questions here and there, perhaps while you talk to get you off your feet, perhaps at the end. We'll find out.
All right. So that sounds good. Yeah. So maybe first I'll start with like the demand and supply. What we're seeing at Compass, like over the last, I'll say 3 to 5 years, the mining industry and like specifically hosting has become more professional. So with that, there's this growing need for quality hosting providers from the market. So, obviously lowest cost is always going to be king and probably the most important factor. But, with the rise of professionalism in the industry, what we're seeing is this need for hosting providers that are strong operators, provide additional services like repair and logistics, obviously have a competitive hosting rate, but also have good prudent risk management processes and due diligence around like the sites and knowing what's capable at the site and the regulatory environment for where that site is located. So that's kind of on the demand side, but on the supply side, at the same time in the U.S., it is getting difficult to kind of find large hosting capacity because there's this competing demand from self miners, the HPC AI industry, and typical data center functions. So that's kind of leading to this imbalance in the demand and supply for the hosting market. Kind of additionally, there's these slim margins, right? Like hash prices at an all-time low, difficulties at an all-time high. So what we're seeing specifically at Compass, more of these institutional customers kind of coming back instead of retail right now. And these institutional customers are kind of taking a longer view and okay with the slim margins, in anticipation of this bull run that we're all hoping happens here soon. On the hardware and like hosting size, and thank you for putting this up, Will. So specifically in the hosting market, we've seen a slight softening in the rates compared to especially 2023, but probably not as low as 2021, right after the China ban and Bitcoin kind of running up. Something that might be interesting for your audience is that in 2003, what we saw is a lot of demand from Bitmain specifically for air-cooled hosting capacity. And so that's kind of what drove up prices along with rising energy prices across the board. But it seems like lately, Bitmain's kind of de-emphasized that air-cooled capacity need and instead favoring more hydro. And so that's kind of contributed to the softening in the air-cooled hosting market. But, like I said before, that the competition remains for cheap energy. What we believe at Compass, if you're a hosting provider, the key to longevity will be vertically integrating, owning the infrastructure that will lead to more of the lower energy costs, and you can pass off those savings, to your customers. On the hardware side, we're definitely seeing a premium with like the new gen models, kind of like the S21 series that we saw a few years ago with the S19 XPs when they first came out. So, just looking at the graph, you can kind of see, depending on what type of model you have, what are the break-even hosting prices. So along the top is kind of various hash price data points. And then within that are for each model, what is that break-even hosting price? So you can see, if you have a J Pro, it's going to be very difficult to be competitive and mining profitably. If you're using a hosting provider, you kind of need access to a newer gen model, whether that's an S21 or the XP series, the S19 XP series.
I want to jump in and go back to the Bitmain thing because that was pretty cool. I heard about that as well, where a lot of the S19 XP units that were mass produced during the end of the bull run and that middle period during the bear market were shipped over to the United States, with Bitmain trying to find a lot of JV partnerships and put these in some sort of like hosting contract in order to get some sort of return on capital for putting these machines out, right? Because they made them, they had to put the chips and wafers together, those purchase orders earlier with TSMC. They had this huge glut of inventory, and maybe Colin can speak about this in a second. And then they were like, okay, what do we do with this? And they were just trying to find hosting partnerships all over the US. I even talked with someone at Bitmain about 3+ months ago, I believe, at this point, where they were still trying to find some hosting spots in the US where they're going to sell the hash rate. But the market was just like not competitive for their price points where they needed to sell it. So I think it's interesting you're bringing that back up and saying that is now slackening as they're putting out hydro units, you said? And what kind of hydro units are we talking about? Are these like the new S21 units, hydros, or former older units as well?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Kind of like the newer gen hydro models from Bitmain, but also finding, you have a different site if you're serving these hydro miners as opposed to like air cooled units. And so I think they're just kind of transitioning over to more of these hydro sites to run these hydro miners.
Gotcha. No, that's a very interesting insight there. Given that you hear about the demand, you don't always hear about the slackening of demand for these things. So good follow-up. Okay, I cut you off. Feel free to take the reins back.
I feel like a lot of what I've said is kind of gloom and doom, but there are opportunities, right? Even with these slim margins. So kind of the combination of slim margins, that high premium that I talked about for the new gens, and then also this abundance of the old gens kind of still on the market, that leads to more profit sharing opportunities. So what we're seeing is, a lot of hosts or site owners have access to cheaper power, but they don't necessarily have the capital to outlay for new gen machines or even old gens in some cases. And so what they're interested in doing is turning that energy into something profitable. And so they're coming to deals to hosting providers or individuals with miners and proposing profit share deals where they're interested in generating a profit and then hopefully capturing that upside, in a bull market. So that's one big opportunity we've definitely seen lately, specifically with the older gen units. Another opportunity is obviously custom firmware. I feel like that's been around for a lot, and a lot of people have talked about it. But just using custom firmware to kind of optimize the profitability of the older gen units. And then specifically for hosting providers, this is an opportunity right now to kind of grow other parts of the business, grow your managed services. So like I talked at the top, there's a lot of institutional customers kind of coming back into the fold who are okay with slim margins. But out of that cohort, there's a subset who also want to own a site themselves. They understand the key to the long play is kind of having access to this low energy, right? But they probably lack the experience or the expertise to kind of develop, build, and operate a site. So it's an opportunity right now for hosting providers to kind of pivot a little bit and offer guidance on site build out and even provide, actual operating services for these interested parties.
The institutional part's also interesting because you don't often think of these institutional miners getting involved with the hosting game, but historically that's been a huge part of their P&L. So Core Scientific, for instance, ran a very large hosting division. I still believe they host quite a lot of Bitcoin miners. And so there's something to that effect here. Seeing that they're going to walk back in. And I just to walk out the logic there, Karun, like they're okay with slimmer margins because like in TradFi, you're used to like 5% in a good year. Is that kind of the thinking versus like us moon boys are like, if I'm not doubling my money in 30 days, this is a scam?
Yeah, exactly. Specifically, like a lot of people from the real estate industry, they kind of like how it's a similar profile, right? Put the capital down, receive that recurring revenue on a guaranteed basis. And so, yeah, they're probably okay with what we call slim margins, but for them are much higher once they get comfortable with the idea of Bitcoin and mining specifically.
Love it. Colin, Matt, any questions?
I have a question, but I feel bad because I didn't prepare Karun with it beforehand. But
hey, I told Karun, I said, we don't know what's going to come out of our mouths. And he said, okay.
So as someone that hasn't spent time in the hosting world right now, seeing and with this kind of like emergence of all the AI stuff, we're starting to see some GPU as a service type models, right? What do you kind of think about that emerging spaces? And I know you've been focused on the Bitcoin mining side, but seeing a couple of those emerge and just interested in your general thoughts as kind of a hosting expert.
Yeah, like on a macro level, right? Like we're competing with them for low energy. That's, the name of the game, right? For both of us. But that being said, from my understanding, to be able to offer that service, you have to outlay a lot of capital for these GPUs. They're a lot more expensive than ASICs. And even the type of facility that you need to house these things, that might be a longer lead time to build out than a mining facility. A mining facility, depending on what it is, when you're going from a greenfield site to a fully functioning facility, whether that's containers or, a commissioned build out, that can be, anywhere from 90 days to maybe 6 months, right? Whereas some of these AI larger data centers is on the time scale of years. So I think Bitcoin mining has the advantage there, like we're more flexible and can build out much quicker. And so even from, a regulatory standpoint, it's more favorable. It can be argued it's more favorable to have mining facilities rather than a large AI data center, right? Like mining facilities can turn on and off. A lot of people have talked about that, right? And if we need to turn off to provide demand to the grid, whereas if you're running a GPU as a service, part of your SLA is being up, right? Like 99.999% of the time, these AI models need to be constantly being run. So definitely competing for the low energy, but, I don't think it's necessarily going to be like they're always going to win the opportunity for energy.
Excellent answer. I feel like a lot of people read the news stories, right, and kind of think of mining and AI as this apples to apples thing. But when you talk to people that are in the game, right, you realize it's more and more of an apples to oranges thing. They actually are quite different. Of course, everything needs energy, right? At the end of the day, they're both quite different.
I would take Corin's in the game.
I guess I would ask what next generation models you all have seen the most appetite for, and if there's any early consensus over whether or not the M60 or S21 series is superior to one or the other, or if there are specific models within either that there have been problems with, as we've seen in the past, right? Like S17 is the kind of infamous example where heat sinks were falling off because the thermal glue was faulty. Has there been any consensus over which one miners seem to prefer?
At Compass, like we're more focused on the Antminer series, so definitely like the S21s. We haven't seen any like major complications. I think when they first came out, a lot of people were worried about overheating, right? Especially in hotter climates like Texas. But that being said, after going through a summer of them, we haven't noticed anything on the scale of like the S19 XPs, for example.
Love it. Corinne, where can we find out more before we boot you?
Yeah. Visit us at, compassmining.io. I'm on LinkedIn and happy to talk hosting and hardware.
Awesome. Thanks, Corinne.
Thanks, Ed.
Interested in Bitcoin scaling, startups, or learning more about Bitcoin Softworks? Join us Saturday, November 9th at the Fidelity Center in Boston, Massachusetts for Op Next, a one-day conference on scaling Bitcoin hosted by Blockspace Media, the producers of this podcast. Join Bitcoiners like Peter Todd, Portland Huddle, and more to discuss various Bitcoin proposals like OpCat, the Great Script Restoration, CTV, and more. Attend workshops, speaker sessions, and panels discussing the latest in scaling tech, from ZK to ARC to Bitcoin Softwork history. And for a limited time, use code OCTOBER to get 25% off a general admission ticket. Find out more by visiting opnext.dev. Again, that's October at opnext.dev. You can find out more by checking out the show notes below.
Matt's question about HPC and AI, a good segue into our last news item. Matt, take it away, my man.
The headline reads, Core Scientific announces an exercise of a final contract option by CoreWeave for delivery of approximately 120 megawatts of additional digital infrastructure to host, wait for it, HPC computing operations. So this was, I guess, kind of a tidbit adding on to a story that started quite a bit ago of this relationship between Core Scientific and CoreWeave. This option is coming to fruition. Now I believe the contracted power agreements between CoreWeave and CoreSci have hit 500 megawatts. So significant there. And as far as just, what's been happening with Core Scientific, right? They have essentially really leaned into the HPC game. And now I think they're approaching a 50-50 split between using their power towards Bitcoin mining and HPC. So they're really kind of being one of those public listed miners that is kind of turning into a hybrid, as, we are going to run infrastructure to support these two different kind of business use cases, that is mining and HPC. What do you guys think about this one? Did I miss anything in this story?
No, I think that is just about it. I mean, there are a few kind of eye-popping numbers, right? So a few just kind of housekeeping things. The options that they're exercising, there have been multiple tranches of these ever since Core Scientific announced its deal with CoreWeave. It seems to be the last of all of them. And the the retrofits that CoreWeave and Core Scientific are going to do on Core Size sites are expected to begin, or the site modifications for the last of this option, I should say, expect to begin in the second half of 2025, with operational status expected to begin in the second half of 2026. This bumps up the deal flow amount for all of these options up to 8.7 billion over 12 years, according to the contractual terms. So definitively now, and it was this way before, but Core Scientific just continues to extend its lead. Core Scientific is the definitive leader for HPC and AI transitions from these public Bitcoin miners. The fact that they've got half a gig worth of deal flow over the next 12 years that could potentially bring in almost $9 billion worth of revenue is pretty substantial. And at this point, it's kind of their race to lose, I think, among the public miners. The big question going forward is going to be, can they actually pull off this retrofit? Now, it'd be really absurd if CoreWeave was just pouring all this time and money into these contracts if they didn't think Core Scientific can do it, especially when you consider that CoreWeave is paying for the modifications. They are footing the bill for the entire thing, at least according to what has been disclosed. And as JP Morgan pointed out, or I should say Reginald Smith and this fella named Purse in their report for, I'm sorry. This fella named Purse. Mr. Purse, I apologize. I forgot your first name. But Smith and Purse, in a recent report for JP Morgan on Bitcoin mining and AI, pointed out that this deal where CoreWeave is going to foot the bill for this is probably a one-off. I mean, that's a pretty incredible deal from Core Scientific's perspective. But it's also a good deal for CoreWeave because they crunch the numbers, and given their estimates, they say that it costs between $10 to $20 million per megawatt to greenfield a tier 3 data center, so to build it from scratch. And that's just the infrastructure. That doesn't include the $30 million per megawatt for the hardware, versus $5 to $7 million per megawatt for retrofitting an existing data center that has the PPAs in place, that has all of the regulations and approval cleared, and that has some infrastructure on site. So I know a lot of people are very skeptical about these kind of retrofits. Obviously, the amount of infrastructure you need, the redundancy, the cooling, everything is just by far and away much more complex than a Bitcoin mining operation. But if they can pull this off, then it's going to, be extremely lucrative for Core Scientific. So
Core Scientific stock price went up on that yesterday, hit $14 a share. So that's pretty good. Core still has a lot of debt, but the revenue pipeline outstanding for this deal has a multiple on the amount of debt that Core currently has. So I think they're in pretty good hands. That would be my take on it. Let's go to the Cry Corner.
Yes. So for this week's Cry Corner, we have
You
Dennis
are way too
Porter.
excited about this.
The reason I'm excited about this is because to me, it's kind of like the Bitcoin mining complement to Trump derangement syndrome. It's like Dennis Porter derangement syndrome. I get it. The guy's kind of a ham. He does the announcement of the announcement thing. There are a lot of things that will like rub people the wrong way, but people are just like slamming him for these things, and I don't really understand why. So basically, Dennis has spent the last week kind of, heralding this groundbreaking announcement that his Satoshi Action Fund has been working on. And this announcement, which he broke today, didn't let the media do it. The state of Pennsylvania has passed a Bitcoin rights in the House by a sweeping majority. Both Republicans and Democrats united together to pass the bill. We love to see a nice bipartisan story. So there it is. For one, I would like to say that a Bitcoin rights bill seems kind of like lip service, but maybe it actually would be beneficial to have this legislation in place in case there's any kind of draconian laws that try to creep in and, tell you can't self-custody your Bitcoin, things like that. So I think it's good news. But the thing that I just like sends me about it, when you go to X and you just search by Dennis Porter, there's like all of these takes. Like, okay, Bugle is one thing. They're like Babylon Bee or the Onion for Bitcoin. So that's fine. But then you have like Bitcoin Magazine's former president, Mike Germano, kind of just like slamming him in tweet after tweet. And then, and you just have all of these reactions about people reacting to his announcement. And like, I get it. Maybe it's a little bit annoying, but like, who cares? Like, he's just, who cares? He has a political action nonprofit. He has a lobbying firm, and he's trying to push forward Bitcoin stuff. And I know there are a lot of people who are like deep in the industry, who are more well connected than me, that say that he's kind of like a bull in a china shop and he does more harm than good, yada, whatever. But I don't know, man. The fact that he's getting some of these bills kind of pushed through some of these state legislators, I think is a good thing. And I don't really understand why people give him so much heat.
Matt, any takes?
Yeah, first of all, if either of you ever characterize me as kind of a ham, I'll be severely hurt. Yeah, I don't know. I was surprised, I guess, to see this as the cry corner this week. States' rights and self-custody, very positive thing. I'm not crying.
It was the Twitter. It was the Twitter beef.
I was laughing while Colin was scrolling through the tweets because we don't need to read it on the show, but go look at Greg Zag's tweet about this concept. That had me laughing pretty hard. Yeah, no, Crypto Twitter is a wild, wild west. I mean, this is a wild space. But yeah, it's happy news in the broader industry of things. And yes, Matthew Kimmel is not a ham.
We've had Dennis on the show. I consider him a friend. I think some of his tweets trying to get Bitcoin for Satoshi Action Fund do verge on cringe cry corner. So I'll give him that, but I'd say that to his face as well. On the Mining Pod, we try to keep it real. So I think we can conclude there. I like the summary that Colin provided, and I liked Matt's takeaways as well. We're not responsible for other people's tweets on this show. So if you saw that while watching, it's not our fault. Go check out everything else on Blockspace Media. Go follow Karoon and Compass Mining to check out more about hosting ASICs. And yeah, we'll see you guys next week for more shows. We actually got a political show next week with Foundry, talk about outcomes from the 2024 presidential election. So that should be good. See y'all later.